Yeah, boy.
You've done a lot of work in mainstream comics, but from the beginning, I always kind of thought of you as this kind of off the path, in that kind of noir side of things. And I'm curious what, growing up, what your influences are. I assume you've read a lot of crime books and, seen a lot of old noir films.
Well, I'll tell you, I've seen a lot of noir films, but I read less crime stuff, but I've actually grew up around crime. So where I grew up in Brooklyn, we had on my block where I lived, we had a mobster and his family. And 2 doors away from me, I had what they call a button man, a guy who would take care of things. He was a big guy, and he would break people's legs or shoot them or whatever he had to do. He was very nice to us. He would take the garbage pails in. He was very polite to my parents. And the people around the corner, they owned like a security business, but they were mob people.
Security.
Yeah. So we grew up I grew up at a time, and this is 60s and early 70s. And if you know anything about the history of film in the early 70s in New York, crime is like a major thing in these things. And so I had a lot of real world stuff like that happening. We had neighbors disappear. I had my cousin himself. He was an alcoholic, and he gambled, and he borrowed money, and then one night he never showed up at home, and his own mother found him 3 days later, or 2 days later. They found his car, and in the backseat of his car, his throat was slashed. He was dead. So that was my cousin. And so I grew up with that, and it's funny because the thing I really enjoyed writing was a Western, Jonah Hex.
I was going to mention that too.
Yeah,
a lot of those crime guys, they fall into, crime and Western.
Yes. So the Western, I was able to move the backdrop to the Old West. And a lot of the stories we did in Jonah Hex are very much crime themed stories, but with a Western feel to them. Obviously the themes are still there, the revenge, the bad guys. And, it's funny because I think we wrote 107 issues of that book, and it was about a bounty hunter, but I could swear only a couple of the actual books ever had him bounty hunting. It was always about Jonah being known as a bounty hunter, and then the world around them gets weird. And so, that part of it makes its way into my work. And also the flip side of that, growing up in Brooklyn, it was, especially with brothers and friends, there was a lot of joy and funny stuff and crazy stuff and Coney Island and everything, which made its way into Power Girl and Harley Quinn and stuff like this. There's a lot of how I grew up in these books. It's not so obvious, but when you write, you tend to go towards familiar things. And so if you wrote when you do your work, there's got to be your life, some of your life in it. Again, a lot of mine was very dark when I was younger because the area wasn't great. And, we grew up, I always tell Amanda this, I didn't know I was poor until around college, when I realized that I wanted to go to a special college, and my dad opened up the bank book and said, "This is all we have." And I was like, "City college for me," and so I didn't. So a lot of that stuff, I didn't know until I was older how poor we were, which made me a great prepper. Meaning, we live in a house, and we live very much in our means, Amanda and I. You know, we're not extravagant people, but we also appreciate anything. You know, like the fans, we appreciate the fans. We appreciate the companies hire us. We're very grounded that way. So my writing does have a sense of a grounded sense to it, and it has a sense of humor. Even my violence has a sense of humor, because a lot of these guys, when I grew up, they were bad guys, but they were funny and they were charming when they wanted to be charming, and they were interesting. And also, they had their own weird integrity to them, even though I wouldn't hang out with them, So you write about the world you're in, and it comes out in different ways. I mean, I could write a book. Amanda keeps not bothering me. She keeps reminding me I should write a book about my childhood. But part of me thinks they're still out there somewhere. If I start writing this, I'm like, I'll wind up, they'll wind up finding me in the alligator lake near my house.
You talked a little about how crime got into your comics. Let's talk about how you decided, hey, I want to do comics. Where did that come from?
So when I was younger, when I grew up, I had 3 brothers, 2 older, 1 younger, and we had comic books all over the house. This was late 60s, early 70s, 13 channels on the TV, no cable, no computers. The world was different, right? No cell phones, none of that. So comic books were always around my house. My uncle owned a barbershop on Flatbush Avenue, and he had comics and Playboys in his barbershop. Everybody waiting for the next haircut. So I always had comic books around, and I loved to read them. And I had a group of friends when I was like in 6th grade that read comics, and they would come over. We'd all go over each other's houses and swap out the comics. We read each other's comics. We'd put an initial on the back of the book, and then we'd swap it out. At the end of the day, we'd give them back. So we traded and read them because we didn't have much money, even though they were only 12 cents or 15 cents or a quarter. Still, the only money I was making as a kid was shoveling snow in the winter and delivering papers or cutting lawns. That was all my money growing up. So I loved comics, and I always would draw all the time. My dad would get this, so he would get reams of paper for us, right? And the paper would be in a box of 500 sheets, let's say, whatever it was, and they'd be white paper, and on the backside it would be somebody's logo or stationery. And my father used to buy the reams for next to no money from a printer that would screw up a printing job. Like they put the wrong name or the wrong phone number, and my dad would get that paper so we could sketch on the other side of it. So we always had a ton of paper that always said like some weird company on the back of it or something, And my dad was pretty clever because he probably only paid a dime for a ream of paper because the printer was like, this is no good, we got to throw it out. My dad would say, I'll take all the paper you got, Once in a while he would cut it so we'd get a smaller sheets and stuff, I guess because it had too much stuff on it. And again, like I said, it wasn't until I was older I realized how poor I was when all my drawings were on bad stationery. So I always loved comics. And then when I was went to high school, I applied for the High School of Art and Design in New York, which was an art-themed school where you pretty much took all the arts, but comic book illustration was one of the classes. So I took comic art there, and while I was in 11th and 12th grade, I got some ghosting jobs working with professionals, Chick Stone and Dave Simons and a whole bunch of guys. And when I got to 12th grade, I realized that comics aren't for me because everyone I'm working for is poor, like worse than me. And so I got out of comics and I went into advertising in the college. I took advertising. And then for the 80s, I pretty much worked in an ad agency that eventually I went from working there to becoming a partner. And it wasn't until around 89, 90, I ran into a friend of mine from high school, Mark Texera, and he was drawing Ghost Rider and The Punisher at the time. And I ran into him, and he said, I could use some help on my books. Do you want to come up to Marvel at night and help me do the backgrounds? I'm like, sure. And that's how, once I started going up to Marvel, I started getting background work. And then I started getting inking work. The editors saw me there every night and said, hey, you work hard here. You want to do a book? And eventually I quit sold the advertising, got rid of the advertising job, and then went into comics full time. And then, I met Joe Quesada. We did Event Comics. Eventually I did Marvel Knights. And then after Marvel Knights, I just started writing. I just put the inking down and went to editing and writing. And so that was my evolution into comics. But they've always been in my life. Even when I was doing advertising and I wasn't doing comics, I was buying comics. I was going to the comic store every Wednesday like everybody else and picking up my books. I have comics all over the place. I could just pull up a comic book. They're all over my house. I love them. They're in my blood. And no matter what I do or whatever, I'll always do comic books because I love them so much.
You have a good attitude. You're likable. And it sounds like you can really pitch and sell projects. And I'm wondering if anything in your upbringing, you can say, maybe that's because of this.
Well, it's funny because when my mom passed away, we found all these old doctor notes and everything. And I found out that I didn't talk till I was around 5, which I didn't know. I don't remember as a kid. And one of the doctor's notes says, well, when he has something to say, he'll talk. He's going to be fine. And I always remember that. I just think that when you're growing up in a place that's a little violent and a little, you tend to not only look out, use your peripheral vision, but you do that mentally as well. You're trying to think what other people are thinking. You're trying to second guess before something happens. And then when I went into advertising, all that was about was selling an idea, right? So we had a campaign. My clients were like Pepsi and Maybelline and, Malpaso's company, Clint Eastwood's company. And so I had to constantly go in front of a group of people and say, okay, here's the campaign we're thinking about. We're thinking about doing these visuals. And I had to make them excited and convince them that, of course, I'm the guy that's going to save their job. So that's part of the job. So as far as pitching something, the secret to pitching anything is really flushing out and believing your idea. You have to flesh out all of it in your head, the whole universe, the whole world, and then believing in it. Because if you don't, nobody else is going to buy it. When I remember I would pitch up to DC, I would say, I got this great idea, this thing, we could sell it like this. And if we get this artist on it, think of how cool that'll be for you guys. So I'm thinking of every angle. Again, because I'm also a huge comic book consumer. I buy comics all the time. And my writing office is in a comic shop. So I see a wall of comics every day, so you're in a position, you said you're an indie guy, you have your voice, but you have to say, who wants to hear this voice? Right? And how can I make this more desirable visually to somebody to pick it up? And it's a simple question to ask yourself when you go to the comic store and look at the wall of books. Why do you gravitate towards certain covers where you go, oh, that's a great cover? Well, you have to slow that down a little bit and say, no, why is this a great cover? Why is it my eye went right to this? And this is something I'm attracted to. And that has everything to do with you figuring out your writing and figuring out, why do I want to tell this story? Sorry, that's thunder. I don't know if you can hear that.
Yeah.
So what is the idea that I want to get across? Why do I think it's interesting enough that somebody else would be interested in listening to it or reading it, want to read it? And it's a very key question because a lot of people rush into things and they hope they're going to find the idea, but it takes a little time to sit down with something and say, why would I want to watch this? Why would I want to read this comic? Like, what is it about it? And I'll tell you, a lot of books fall apart when you ask that because you realize, we all realize this, sometimes you have a box full of comics and there's only like 3 or 4 you really like in it. And it's great if you can take out the 3 or 4 and say, why do I like these 3 or 4? They did something in the story that I reacted to, or the art is speaking to me, or this is the coolest thing ever I've seen in the comic, and look at this double pace, and the way that guy turned it all on that, you know. So there's these little things that make your entertainment, your stories, where it hits you, right? My thing is, if you can slow it down and put down on paper, like, why do I like this Star Wars and not that Star Wars? And why do I like this guy as James Bond, but I don't like that guy? You know, and again, why is this pizzeria better than that pizzeria? It's a basic human thing, but it has everything to do with how you address the consumer. So you can be the most indie guy in the world, but you come up with an idea that people look at it and go, oh, I want to get that. Like, that looks like I want the answer to that, or I want to know more about that idea. And that's what advertising is. See, advertising is, I have one chance to hook you on this product. So if I can't do it visually, I'm going to sell you, you know, insurance commercials sell you a theme. Bum, 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 bum. You know, you hear these things. It's all about selling. Or you know, you'll have a beer, and the beer will look like the best beer in the world, and all of a sudden you're thirsty. You're watching that. Or there's food. When you're hungry, you see a great commercial. Like, I don't go to Red Lobster. I live near the ocean, but those commercials look amazing, you know? So you have to think of your writing like that, and what your book like that. It's like, what is it that's going to make this really appealing to somebody? It can't be so in your head. You have to get, you can get the craziest idea out there if you have the right pitch. Because like I said, some of the weirdest movies, Angel Heart, we talked about Angel Heart. How do you pitch that, right? You know, it's a very complicated story without ruining the story. It's about a guy who has to track down somebody that's very familiar to him, but he doesn't know it, you know. So we see an artist's hand gets a story. Two different guys could have directed that same Angel Heart script, and it would have been two different movies. And same thing with comics. People all have stories to tell. You have to make it you have to own it and put your language into it the way you would tell it, and pull yourself out of the story and say, the way I'm telling it is going to be different, you know. And that's what makes a great indie comic, is a very distinctive voice.